Hello all. We're almost there. We've almost made it to the end of the year. This is our final Geekfest of 2020, and what started as kind of a way to keep ourselves amused when the world seemed to be going crazy has kind of come to its natural conclusion. And it's great to have you all in the room today just to talk through the latest and final Guardian Essential report for the year with myself and my partner in crime, Katharine Murphy from Guardian Australia.
Hello, guys.
Hello. Let's do our, I won't even call them formalities, because once they become formalities, they lose their meaning. Let us recognise that wherever we are in Australia, we're on Indigenous land. I'm on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and wherever we are, we do pay respects to elders past, present, emerging, and recognise the land we're on was never ceded. And I think also recognising the land of this country has kind of been a pretty good place to be in 2020, Katharine, as we get to the end of the year, as we tend to do and reflect on what we've learnt in the journey. We're in a pretty good place, aren't we?
Yeah, it's
all things considered.
All things considered, with due respect to everybody's suffering and difficulties this year, with due respect to the people who have died of COVID, with due respect to people who have lost businesses and lost jobs. Yes, you would rather be here than pretty much anywhere else in the world. I was actually talking to one of my colleagues about this yesterday, that it's sort of hard, I think, for Australians to grasp just how miserable things are in the Northern Hemisphere, in America and Europe, as those countries kind of get ready for Christmas. It's just diabolically awful. And we are not in that position, partly by luck, partly by management, partly by geography, partly by having a functional community that rose to the challenge. We're in a different place, and we can hope, given where the sort of vaccines are queuing up now in terms of the rollouts, that by the time winter rolls around here next year, that we at least will have started a vaccine rollout. It's not clear to me how far that will have gone, touch wood, assuming no dramas, but I think we will have started rolling out the vaccine to vulnerable groups by winter next year. And hopefully that means that we will still be relatively okay, touch wood. Now I've just offended my golden rule, Peter, of tempting fate. I just did it. I just tempted fate.
Oh, at least you haven't booked a holiday in Byron Bay.
No, I have not. I absolutely have not. I'm doing better than that. So, yeah. Anyway.
So how do we look at it? There are all sorts of things that are still wrong about the way we conduct our politics. We don't have a federal ICAC. We haven't had meaningful action on climate change. Mm-hmm. We're still a little bit in thrall to certain media dynasties in control in the sort of public debates we have. We're very exposed geopolitically at the moment, caught twixt and tween between China and the US, and yet the institutions that we do work have operated under the stewardship of a conservative government. How do you put all those pieces together and look at where we are politically?
Well, there is, look, as you say, there's a lot, you've kind of broadly listed the dysfunctions in Australian public life. They're certainly there, and there are significant failures in public policy, climate change being at the top of the list. But I think we're not as, we've sort of had elements of the populism that's kind of afflicted other democracies after the GFC. We've certainly had a bit of that, but we haven't sort of gone entirely off the reservation. Our systems, as you say, Peter, do function still. And I think too, we're paying Scott Morrison stewardship here, and I do in terms of COVID, but we also need to recognise that a lot of the power that's existed in decision making during 2020 has actually been with the state governments, not with the Commonwealth. the Commonwealth has kind of created structures to put some leadership around those decisions and trying to, create a certain standardisation of decision making that's been beneficial for the nation. But at least on the public health side of the ledger, we've rediscovered that the power in the federation exists with the states in terms of the public health responses, the policing responses and other things. In terms of China, that's obviously in the Commonwealth's bailiwick. That is, a very complicated set of circumstances that I suspect is going to dominate public discussion for many months yet. And I guess, coming back to your question, Peter, was like, well, it sort of functions even though bits of it don't. Well, I guess we'll have a debate too over the months about to what extent Australia's invited this retribution from China and to what extent, that's been mishandled, it's not even the word I'm looking for, a stuff up by Scott Morrison, or whether it was an unavoidable set of circumstances that have brought us to this juncture. Obviously, Australia has been in a position with China over the last couple of years. It's not just this year. This has built up for at least 2 or 3 years, where we have had to more forcefully articulate some liberal democratic values, and that has sort of created the sort of bedrock of the hostility we see now from Beijing towards Australia. That's built up through foreign interference, through the Huawei decision, through a bunch of things where Australia has basically been standing up pretty forcefully, saying there's a soft power exercise underway here. It's highly problematic for democracies. Australia framed a bunch of questions that then were asked in other democracies around the world. There's a certain amount of retribution for that now from China. Now, is that a stuff up? Well, it comes to a point of time, I think, where the values of the two civilizations or the two countries are very hard to reconcile in some sort of compromise frame, right? Like, you can't actually trade away liberal democratic values. But of course, there are a bunch of decisions that Morrison's made over the last six to 12 months which have inflamed the situation. Now, you could argue whether or not that should have been done more diplomatically than it was. Maybe that would have made a difference, maybe it wouldn't. But anyway, so that's a kind of moving part outside the, do institutions function or not? The lesson of 2020 is our institutions still function despite us having suboptimal outcomes in some respects. But then China sits, sort of next to all of that as the story of the last 3 months of this year and the story probably of the first 6 to 12 months of next year.
Yeah, it almost feels like the year was bookend by two really big sort of meta events, the bushfires and China, and in the middle of it we have this global pandemic just to sort of shake things up and keep us honest. So it's been a bit of a buffeting. Shall we go into the last lot of results for the year? I'll do the share screen. I should have said at the start, if you haven't already introduced yourself in chat, do so. If you've got questions, I think we'll open mic it a bit towards the end because it feels like that's the sort of day it is. And I will just hopefully get this up in just 1 second so everyone can see the beautiful presentation that John, our head geek, puts together every week. And thanks, John, for all your work through the year. We'll start off. So the approval of Morrison has actually dropped a few points over the last month, but it is still way higher than most mortal leaders. We remember Kevin Rudd being up in the 60s through the GFC, the last big global crisis. But
I think Kevin actually was in the 70s, like sort of pre-GFC. But anyway.
Yeah, that's right. He peaked it when he was going to take over the state health systems, if I remember. And
I think that's right.
Yeah, there was a lot of Kevin love there for a while, wasn't there? But what's your, particularly noting the audience we're in and the way that we look at the world, I guess, I feel that Morrison's success this year was because everyone's success is their weakness. His weakness is he's a guy from marketing, but actually a guy from marketing who cherry picks the ideas and finds something that works, and then does that in a real crisis, so that it wasn't an ideological response. It was actually a pretty pragmatic response. There's something about what he's done. If you look at where he was before the pandemic at 41, 49, and where he is now.
Yeah.
Should we give him credit?
Well, that's what I was going to point out, right? And this graph gives us a nice visual on it, right? So if we look where he was sort of at the tail end of the bushfires, which was in that 40 zone. And
39, 52.
Yeah. Right. So I think the thing in terms of do we give him credit or not, here's what I would observe about the Prime Minister in the last 12 months. He had, and forgive me if I've said this before in this group, we've had 2 federated crises in Australia this year. The first was the bushfires, and I mean federated crises what I mean by that is the states have the power, right? The states had the power in the bushfires, and the states had the power in COVID. And we see a tale on this chart, beautifully illustrated tale of 2 crises. One he didn't manage well, and one he managed a whole lot better. So it's sort of, I don't know if it's so much the marketing thing, Peter, or whether it just demonstrates that this guy can learn on his feet. He can, because it was obviously a terrible pounding during the bushfires. He really stuffed that up. And I think he went into the pandemic with a very, very clear sense that he would not do that again. He would not make those same mistakes again. And he would set up a structure for decision-making that didn't strand him in the Federation, didn't basically have him sitting in the middle of the Federation without any influence and without any designated role, which is where he was in the bushfires.
Because that was that famous, it's not my job to hold the hose.
Hold the hose,
mate.
yeah.
And I think you're right. But I also think maybe, again, for a marketing guy, he missed the symbolism of the fires. He also missed the consequence of the fires. But I think that idea of a national cabinet, not just practically in making the government work, but symbolically in having this single point of truth, I guess, when you...
that's right.
Was... I won't say it was a masterstroke, but it was very, very competent politics. And
it was.
And he's been reaping the dividends ever since. And there's been a lot that's gone wrong. And there's been some iterations, some apologies, some U-turns, but we've been forgiving. And, this is, I know some of you will look, well, who are the 66% that are answering this poll? It's not like the people I talk to. This is the population. I think John will tell us of those that support Morrison at the moment, 40% of Labor voters saying, yeah, you did a good job, mate. Like, it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to vote for him, but they give credit. Yeah,
well, that's right. And it's sort of interesting, not that we publish 2 PPs anymore, but, yes, victory, yes. But anyway, what 2 PP information that we have published over the course of this year indicates that the contest is closer than Morrison's approval ratings would suggest. So there's sort of a tale of 2 realities. But yeah, look, I think, Morrison sort of, as you said, Peter, he kind of, it's partly symbolism, it's partly, as you said, really insightfully a minute ago, it was sort of like creating a shared truth. That's sort of what the governance structure was about. And that was particularly important in a public health crisis, I think, to try and create, I mean, look, the states and the Commonwealth haven't been a single voice. The states and the Commonwealth have been at active or passive war through a lot of this period, right? There've been very intense deliberations that have resulted in decisions that have been actually fascinating to watch. But putting that structure around decision making was useful in a number of respects. And Morrison may not be making the substantive decisions about when things close or reopen or whatever, but he is reaping the benefits of those decisions politically because he's created a mechanism that is controlled by the Commonwealth. The National Cabinet is controlled by the Commonwealth in the way that COAG never was. COAG was always, the power in COAG was always diffuse. The National Cabinet is a Commonwealth-owned structured entity where the Commonwealth keeps the records, the Commonwealth sets the agenda, the Commonwealth stands in front and owns the messages. So, you know, that's kind of been Morrison's innovation. But hilariously, that was completely extemporised in the room, as I've reported in the quarterly essay, reported for The Guardian prior to the quarterly essay. These guys just made that up in the room in the middle of March. It wasn't that Morrison went in there with this being a cunning plan. They just made it up in the room. And for, you know, and I guess they've all reaped the benefits. It's not just Morrison. We haven't done kind of state leaders approvals.
Well, yeah, and I don't think we're going to do it today, but it has been the year of the incumbent.
Incumbents, exactly.
Where there has been contests, ACT, NT, and critically Queensland, resounding returns for incumbents, where Morrison and his cohorts have attempted to blunder into those contests that hasn't gone well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So there was also, I don't know your thoughts on this, is there and my reading of this is there's this kind of a post-partisan or beyond partisanship, in that I think Morrison's success is also a product of success of Australian government, and because you're, you know, in the chair, you do benefit from that. And there's always an advantage to incumbency in politics, but it feels like it's almost like tennis now, where you're serving, it's really hard to break serve.
Well, it is. Well, in these conditions, it is. Like, obviously, if these conditions change, then more normal political dynamics return, I think. And also we've had the live test of what happens to you if you stuff this up, which was Donald Trump, right? Biden has officially won the election in the United States today. That is predominantly attributable, I think, to Trump making an absolute massacre of the coronavirus response, right? So it's not...
And doing everything that Morrison didn't do.
Exactly. And it's sort of, I don't know, forgive me again if I've said this in this group, but it's the fascinating thing too, if you can get your hands on it, to track down that Bob Woodward book about Trump, and you can read about the same lot of information that Australia and the US were assessing at the same time, and the different responses that happened. And that literally has made all the difference in terms of the outcomes in the two countries. But anyway, right. So I'm just saying it's not incumbency with a blank check. It's incumbency if you seem to be competent. That's the issue. Or if you seem to be doing your best. And sort of picking up your post-partisan framework, Peter, I think possibly, I think it's sort of it's almost just a step simpler than that, I reckon. At least in the pandemic, I think what most Australian voters have seen is a bunch of governments doing their best, right? Not getting everything right. In fact, getting some things really wrong, really, you know, quite substantially wrong. But from the not in, you know, we shouldn't look at these things through the lens of engaged people in politics. We should take a big step back from that and look at how people who are not very engaged in politics are examining their institutions and examining the responses this year. And I think from that step back vantage point, what people would see or believe they had seen was governments doing their best in exceptional circumstances. And they've been rewarded for doing their best. And that means there's some slack in the system when stuff-ups happen. It's not sort of like, would never darken my door, Premier Daniel Andrews or Scott Morrison, I'm never going to look at you again, you're a dreadful cretin. You know, it will, they're given people are giving leaders a bit of room to, just because it's complex, right? And not everybody gets it right all the time. But as long as they're broadly competent, as long as they're making decisions that people think are broadly in their interests, then we see the reward for it on this little chart.
Let's go to the next little chart, which is, what do we make of opposition? I've written today that I think the only test for an opposition this year was not to be such a pork chop that you're never going to be eligible for public office in the future. And there were a number of state opposition leaders who did not pass that test.
Correct.
Not all from the one party, I might add. Albanese kind of ends the year with net goodwill from the voters. Like most opposition leaders, a reasonably high level of non-committal as well.
Yeah.
You're close to the action. What's the vibe in Labor at the end?
Well, they're all horrendously demoralised, but it's sort of like I don't actually understand why, really, because I think Albanese, again, you can have all kinds of views about whether Albanese does or doesn't cut it, whether or not, he's the best opposition leader that Labor's ever had, like all that we can debate till the cows come home. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of a year where oppositions were just blown off the map by incumbents and by a massive crisis, right? Like oppositions just ceased to exist in Australia really for the last 12 months, not through want of trying. Like obviously Albanese's been turning up every day. I think Labor's critique of the pandemic response has been sharp, well-informed and sort of on the pace. And I think Albanese's political calculation, which is where you started, Peter, by not just turning yourself into a pork chop, right? Not just screeching about every little thing. I think that political call's been correct. And I think that's why he's still on the map at the end of the year, right? And he is still on the map here. I guess what I would be worried about, setting aside, that Labor people have really talked themselves into a funk here. That's how we ended the year. Setting that aside and just looking at the merits of the situation, if you were Labor, you would be, I think, a bit worried how persistent the don't know cohort is here in this group. Like on the plus side, you'd be happy that don't know hasn't stampeded into disapproval. Yeah. You would be happy about that. You would be, because that's, sorry, let me be clear about this trade-off, right? Like what Peter is actually saying is that Albanese could have turned up to every opening of every envelope and screeched his head off and said how insane, dreadful and horrendous it all was. Then everybody in Australia would know who Anthony Albanese was, but his negatives by now would be so off the charts that it would have been actually damaging for him and for Labor to do that, right? So that's one model. He didn't do that. He's been a bit more recessed. Now, that probably explains why there's a big cohort of don't knows, and the don't knows aren't stampeding one way or the other. They aren't going to, I hate that guy, or I love that guy. But Labor would have to treat next year as an election year, and you would want some movement in that don't know cohort.
Well, if you take the bar on the left of that chart and the bar on the right of that chart and superimpose them over each other, they're basically the same chart. So, it's kind of been a year of standing still.
A year of standing still, yeah.
You would hope, and I think there has been to an extent, while you're not at the centre of the game, there's opportunities to do other things, such as think about what you're going to take to the next election. I have reason to think there has been some of that work going on. I thought that Albo's budget in reply speech had some new ideas and had the start of something to take forward next year. So, and that whole idea that Morrison has succeeded by basically governing like a Labor government in terms of being collaborative, putting the needs of people before big economic models or deficits or economic indicators, and I guess to an extent adapting what they used to call Keynesian economics means that maybe the points of differentiation won't be there, but the more likelihood is that Morrison will revert to Liberal type, and we can start seeing that at the moment, particularly in the wind back of some of the supports, and also whatever they are trying to do with IR, and we're not too sure, but we've got a couple of numbers about that in a sec as well. Quickly, preferred PM, I'm not going to dwell on that for that very reason. It hasn't been totally stable, but you know, that kind of, there's Morrison's halfway there, Albo's halfway there.
Half on half.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
but yeah, we don't love this stuff anyway because it's horse race. So, well, this is the most interesting chart for me because I find it a little bit counterintuitive. I was expecting, for some reason, and maybe just from my privileged position in my attic, that people would not have been so negative about the year, but it's been a shit show and people get that. And I guess that was my wake-up call. Not everyone gets to spend their life on a Zoom in their attic having, you know, probably a better time than they normally did. And it's been a bad year. Look at these differences in net positive, negative for the economy, for small business, for people's personal situations. A lot of people are neutral, but the overall story is that it's been a bad year for Australians and Australia and the economy. Where it hasn't been so bad and the shifts in sort of net negative have reduced are in things like politics in general and the government, where, well, not so much the government if it's -7 to -7, but politics in general is kind of the negativity has dropped away a bit. I was also interested in the net negative for the planet dropping significantly, Katharine, given that there's been I guess, you know, there's nothing like a pandemic to cut down short-term emissions, but hasn't been great in terms of moving anything. I guess getting Trump out of the White House is a bit of a positive.
Well, that is a big positive, and may actually translate to some real momentum next year. But it is. I just think, notwithstanding the polling that we and others produce that says, you know, there's a huge cohort of people who think climate change is happening and we need to get on with it. It's sort of like, it's just in conditions like this, it sort of just recesses in people's minds. I think it's because they're so it's just. You know, has anything material happened, or are people just not as focused on it? I guess I would just put that out there for discussion. I don't know that it's necessarily reflective of people thinking, you know, the planet somehow has prospered in these conditions. It just may be that it's not as front of mind as it was 12 months ago. So,
what do you make? Like, what do we make of the non-scheduling of Morrison on this global stage to talk about climate? Is that
interesting decision? Very interesting decision. It's sort of because Morrison obviously thought he was going, and I think he believes that Boris
even packaged up his announceable.
He did. He had a whole message frame that rolled out over about 6 weeks. He had a whole plan for what he was going to say at this summit. And I think the government, people around him think that genuinely that Boris did invite him to make a contribution to the summit and was overruled by other protagonists in the summit, namely the UN and Europe. And look, that may be true or may not be. In any case, it was tough competition to get yourself a speaking gig at that summit. You needed to have something.
There was only 70 speakers.
Yeah, there was a designated number. The organisers of the summit were very clear with all of the world leaders months out that here was the criteria for appearing. You know,
and surprisingly, announcing you were going to stop beating your wife wasn't regarded
strangely a sort of status quo. We're not quite as, you know, we're not going to be quite as awful as previously we had signaled we would be. No, strangely didn't make the cut. So, you know, I think it just very interesting decision by the rest of the world, and it sends a pretty clear signal to Australia that we will, if we're wanting that a sort of a pretense of a pivot won't cut it. Like that, Australia needs to come to the party with something tangible to say that that is different from the record in over the last 10 years or so, particularly. It's sort of interesting too, because just very quickly, we've seen just over this past, say, 10 days or so, we've seen the rest of the world rally to Australia's cause quite significantly on China, right? We've had country after country come out and say China's being completely inappropriate here. China is, the critique of Australia is completely outside of diplomatic norms. This trade war is terrible. There's been this incredible, quite organic rallying to Australia's cause in this big fight with China, right? But on climate, there was no rallying to Australia's cause. There was nobody who basically gave Scott Morrison a life raft to stand up and mouth some words that had very little meaning. So it's just interesting. That counterpoint is interesting to me.
And I think it gets even more interesting just going on to economic expectations. And I suspect maybe less so COVID and more so China will be now shaping our economic expectations for the year ahead. But it gets really interesting, doesn't it, where the sign of Chinese aggression is not buying coal off Australia. So that's kind of where the climate and the geopolitics comes together. How do we read, and we've got some public findings, but how do you read where the government is, like, obviously the government's in the middle, like they're kind of between whatever in the deep blue sea. What do you think their decision, what factors are driving the way they play it over the summer? It just seems like week by week there's another export that's being blocked. We're looking for support from allies and friends. What's going through your head if you're trying to navigate your way through this?
Well, Scott Morrison's sort of trying to do two things simultaneously, and the terrible tweet from the Chinese Foreign Ministry about the Brereton report sort of created the conditions for him to do two things simultaneously. One is to play to domestic sentiment that, as Australians are obviously on Team Australia, right? And we'll get to those numbers, I'm sure, right?
Well, I'm going to flick through to them as you talk, just because.
Well, it might make more sense, right? We're like sort of domestic sentiment. We're on Team Australia. China's being nasty bullies to us. We haven't invited this. That's the majority of sentiment. There is also a significant minority sentiment here that the government's stuffed things up. But anyway, the majority sentiment is wicked China. We're the innocents here. So Morrison signalling to that by not taking a backward step, right? Like I went through the succession of commodities, it's kind of like, he's just had a reasonably calm, consistent message, which is obviously this is undesirable, seeking clarification and he escalated slightly today on coal. He said if this is actually an official ban, well, that's in breach of WTO rules and also in breach of Chapter, in breach of the bilateral free trade agreement. So he's sort of, he's signalling to Australians that they should be angry about this mistreatment, while signalling to Beijing, I am open for normalisation of relations. I am open for a dialogue. I am absolutely at the end of a telephone anytime you want to call. And I think the tweet by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson presented Morrison with that opportunity, because if Morrison had come out, just in terms of what's he balancing, Peter, which was your question, right? What's he balancing? If Morrison had come out apropos of nothing in the middle of a trade war with China and appealed for talks with the Chinese leadership that would have looked weak domestically in terms of that majority sentiment that we're talking about, right? Would have looked as though we're, tugging the forelock, right? Whereas because he had an opportunity, because that tweet was such an overstatement, so much outside diplomatic norms, he had an opportunity there to crash through and demand an apology. But at the same time, what he was actually doing while demanding the apology was saying to President Xi and the regime in Beijing, we want to normalize relations. We want to, we've hit rock bottom now. Why don't we use this as an opportunity to try and set things on a more constructive footing? So it's sort of like China gave Morrison the opportunity to signal both things at once, which is, we're not for turning, we will fight them on the beaches, please pick up the phone, right? Which is what he's doing out of both sides of his mouth at present time. And
it looks like it's working. John, I'm wondering with this particular slide and some of the others, is there much of a partisan divide in the attitudes to this, or is Morrison kind of carrying?
So on this issue, there isn't too much of a partisan divide. So what we had was, let me just get the figures up here. Sure, Liberals or people voting for the coalition at least, we're looking at about 67-33. That Australia was the innocent victim, so the majority there. But we also saw the majority with Labour at 59-41 and other minor and independent votes. So it was really the Greens voters who were a bit more 50-50.
Yeah, so we don't read this as a domestic political crisis at the moment, Katharine, but it's clearly going to materially impact what happens to the economy next year.
Yeah.
And that's where it's important business. And again, to their credit, Labor's not getting in the way.
Yeah, well, I think it's just a gap. Obviously, elite players in the economy who have got a lot of wealth tied up now in exporting product to China are obviously off their heads with fear, concern, anxiety, worry, would like the government to tamp this down. Whatever it takes, please just let us, keep selling stuff. So that's sort of happening at the elite level. At the ordinary person level, the having a fight with China domestically is popular to the extent that a country's being seen to defend its own values. As you say, Peter, where these two things then intersect is next year and what the impact will be on the economy in the event that our largest trading partner no longer wants to buy what we're selling. That will have an obvious negative impact on the Australian economy. And then the politics of the China dispute may become more problematic for the Prime Minister to navigate. But clearly he is hoping that at some point through a combination of external pressure on Beijing, as in this full court press that's been happening around the world in support of Australia, and just basic sort of self-interest, right? You can get these products, services, commodities from Australia reliably, therefore it's in our mutual interest to keep on trading with one another. I think Morrison's hoping that a reset will emerge at some point and we won't be in a situation where in 6 months' time we're still in the freezer and that is impacting our capacity to recover from COVID next year. And look, I don't know whether what will happen. I've lacked my crystal ball in this conversation today. I've not brought it along, so I don't know what's going to happen.
Well,
but anyway, it's going to be an interesting 12 months.
Because we predicted 2020 so well at the end of last year, so those balls, they're more like the snow cones where you get, there's a whole lot of interference.
Interference.
This line's up. 49% are not desperate for a rebuilding of the road.
No.
There is a sense that I think Australians also want to see, I guess, some sort of diversification of our relationship, although I don't suspect we can sell quite as much stuff to New Zealand as we're selling
probably not the same stuff. We might be able to sell different stuff, but not this stuff. So yes, anyway, it's I think it's I'm not surprised that half the country thinks.
And I thought this was quite, I thought the last one I was showing was quite interesting, that it's a little bit more split whether Morrison taking the high road on that tweet was actually a thing. And I know I asked myself the same question. Do you just let something like that go through the keeper? I get, though, your analysis that it was actually used as a device and an excuse to get things.
It was an excuse to get up a message that would have been really hard for him to get up in any other frame. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, it's great that you're in that circumstance. It doesn't, I'm not suggesting he's a genius for, you know, punting us collectively into these conditions, but faced with a really difficult diplomatic stoush, there was only, I think, that was the only opportunity, and domestic political sentiment. I think Morrison had only one opportunity to try and push for a normalisation of relations, and that was under the guise of demanding something from Beijing. So
we've just got a couple more slides, and then I'll sort of come to the room and just have a bit of a general put a fork in the year, I reckon. So really quickly, IR, it raised its head this week. I think there was a bit of a, I don't know your take. I'm going to ask you your take, but there seemed to be a difference in where Porter was going and where Morrison was going. I think this slide's interesting in that there is the assumption when people hear industrial reform from this government that it's not going to be in the workers' interests. Give me your take, and I'll just flick through a couple of other slides while we're doing that.
Yeah, well, it was interesting, wasn't it? Yeah, because like that sort of predisposition is important to chart, the finding in the previous chart, which is that like the resting sentiment out there in voter land is, if the coalition's promising industrial relations reform, well, you know, look after your pay packet because you might be in a spot of bother, right? Which is, call that the work choices overhang. Then the government kind of rolled out various components of its reform agenda from the benign to the genuinely nasty, which was the last instalment, which was sort of out.
I think we missed the genuine nasty in our polling, John, but the benign stuff was reasonably well received.
Yeah, the benign stuff is well received. And this is interesting too, I reckon, even though this one we've got on the screen now, even though it's obviously, it's asking about the benign issue, which was the treatment of casuals. It's sort of, because I have wondered myself whether or not this is strangely a sort of relatively safe time for the government to approach this issue, because at the moment, I think a lot of Australians, as the economy recovers, will be quite preoccupied with hanging on to their job, right? And if they have to lose some conditions, perks or benefits in order to hang on to their job, they're probably going to be more keen on hanging on to their jobs than on keeping every single benefit that is currently associated with that job. So, and I think this is a proxy question that indicates that there is a bit of that around. There is a bit of that sort of, we'll call it understanding that maybe some things need to change because of circumstances, but you wouldn't want to push that too hard. And in terms of where the government ended up, well, I sort of had to laugh, really. It's sort of, they rolled out the nasty, which was the change to the boot test, the better off overall test, or the suspension of it. It was sort of not in the public domain for 24 hours before they started, inching away from it, kind of pulling it back. Now, look, maybe, and you said, Peter, there's a bit of a difference between Porter and Morrison, and Porter was more into it than Morrison was. Again, look, I don't know. Maybe they'll stand and defend it over the summer and see how it goes. But I am very confident that this is not a prime minister who is going to die on the hill of industrial relations reform.
No. And there was this real opportunity to just put a marker at the end of the year, given they'd set up these consultative structures and they actually did have some benign reform, even just to land something where there was a bit of common interest. It seemed to me like a massive missed opportunity, and almost like a bit of a stuff up, in that the one thing that really concerned the ACTU about what's really technical around the boot, and it's not as clear cut as it's coming out publicly, but that they didn't think through that it hadn't been through that consultation process. So why throw it in there? Just seemed like maybe they're a bit tired as well to be generous towards them.
Well, that is possible because they are massively exhausted because it's been a hell of a year, and Christian Porter has had a busy, complicated year, but in a policy sense, he's had a massive workload, just like a massive workload all year. So possibly, they just chucked it in without thinking about it. Or they chucked it in to test the waters, see how residual the work choices effect is, right? Put something out into the marketplace, see how the public respond. If there's some appetite for it in the circumstances, maybe you do it. But I don't think they will persist with it, honestly. If they think that gives an open door for the trade union movement and Labor to campaign around that point between now and the next election, and coupled with superannuation and the super guarantee, there's two very highly campaignable issues there. And I don't think the government is so wedded to doing this that they will do it in the face of the obvious kind of campaign that's marshalling in the background. John Howard did it because John Howard's, key aspirations in public life were make the tax system more friendly to traditional families and deregulate the labour market. They were the things John Howard wanted to do in public life. That was obvious throughout his long service that was what he wanted to do. And he would go to the wall to try and do it. And he did. And he lost his seat. Scott Morrison is not going to go to the wall on this stuff.
One more. 8% of us. Is it 8 or no? 10% now are never going to get vaccinated.
Yeah, 10. It's up to 10. And I thought the movement here was interesting too. Because there's been a drop in
because the sense of urgency,
Is that what it is? I don't know. I was very interested in this. I don't know what it means, but I think that drop in people saying they'd get vaccinated ASAP, which is what they were saying whenever we last asked the question. John, when was that? When did we last ask this question? I can't remember.
Yes, the last time was in August.
August, yeah. Okay.
Hi, can I ask you two things, John? Is the number higher amongst young people, and is it higher amongst Green voters, just out of interest?
The big difference here isn't necessarily with the Greens voters, it's with voters of other minor parties.
Yes.
So we put those together just because of the sample sizes, but the majority of that group is made up of people who say they're voting One Nation particularly. And there it's about 19% who say they would never get vaccinated.
Yeah, right. Ooh. Oh. Sorry. Dear, oh dear. Yes, it's a worry. It's look, it's a sort of blip here, but I reckon this is a question we need to keep asking, guys. We need to keep this in the sort of framework of questions we're asking regularly, because it's kind of scary, really. We're back into sort of the post-truth void, which is anyway. Yes.
And just finally, one for our Christmas stocking. 31% are going to spend less than previous years, and 24 are having less attending than in previous years. But maybe that's got nothing to do with the pandemic, and we've just all become a little bit more comfortable in our own solitude. I don't know.
No, I think it's probably pandemic, isn't it?
Most things are.
And fear of, losing your job. So you're not spending as much.
Yeah. Now, I have not been watching the chat at all. So if you want to ask a question, put it in fresh now so I can see what's coming through. I guess the other thing that we like to do at the end of the year, and I'm not giving you any warning on this, Katharine, but a political highlight of the year or something that really sticks out. Like just a really good play by a or a number of politicians.
Oh God.
Anyone else that's got one, put it in the chat. I was going to, while you're thinking, I was going to offer it to Daniel Andrews just for turning up every single day of the hard lockdown, just getting there day in, day out and coming through the other end, you know.
Oh, well, look, what's been achieved in Victoria, you know, I've got a slightly less benign sense about Andrews because he turned up all right, but he didn't answer many questions. But anyway, putting that to one side, what has been achieved in Victoria is phenomenal, like world-beating, phenomenal. So anybody on the chat from Melbourne, again, we've said this throughout the year, Peter and I, we salute you, we love you, thank you for, you know, saving the rest of us from some sort of catastrophic end to the year. It is amazing, seriously, what they have done in a public health sense.
Nowhere else in the world did they pull that off. Like, no. You could say New Zealand had a hard lockdown, but they didn't have the outbreak to start with.
No, exactly. It's like, it is phenomenal. And that is a combination of Andrews just sticking the course when the mob here were literally throwing everything, you know, not only the kitchen sink, but the sink factory at him. He stayed the course. But it is like seriously a victory for the people of Melbourne who also complied with that public health response, even though it was hard. It was really difficult for people. So, I mean, that's got to be a highlight. I'm sorry to semi-borrow yours, but that has got to...
Tracy's put in a pitch and Eric's backed it up for Matt Keane.
Yeah, well, that was what I was going to say, actually. I think, like, two things that may not be obvious, like just this is totally off the top. I'll just say Albo first. I'll get to Matt Keane, but Albo first. Like, you know, the sort of morale morass here is giving insufficient credit, I think, to Albanese's core political judgments this year, which I think actually were the right ones. And it's one of those things where there's no counterfactual. We won't ever see Albanese play out a completely different 2020 for us and be able to compare the two states of reality. But anyway, I just think he made the right political calls. He may pay a price for it, but he did the right thing. In terms of Keane, yes, Keane is very much to the fore in my own thinking because he is a Liberal who is genuinely trying to move the dial on climate action in Australia's most populous state. He has produced a transition policy in that state that will actually drive emissions reduction very significantly in the electricity grid in the critical decade, which is the one that we're approaching now. And he did it with multi-partisan support. He somehow managed to saddle up the Nats. He somehow managed to get Labor across the line and not say no on it. It's like that is a really important thing that's happened. And I hope that the Liberal and National parties in Canberra are capable of learning from that.
And, you know, with that happening in New South Wales, Biden happening in the States, it feels like this sense that the federal political mechanism has not been able to land something that maybe external events will force anyway. So There's
obviously, yes, we should also, I mean, the most significant thing to happen to the world this year was that Donald Trump lost the election. That is really important to so many issues, including my singular obsession, which is climate change.
Yeah. And I'll throw in my hobby horse. The legislation on the to create a media bargaining code was introduced last week.
Yep, a world first.
Driven by Paul Fletcher, stewarded through by Morrison. With the active support, I recognise of News Corp, but also of Guardian Australia, 9 other media outlets. I think both with Keane and I think a bit with Fletcher too, that sense that not all the good players play on the one side probably does apply. And one of the things from this year was to look for acts of leadership across the political spectrum. And my wrap-up column for the year, which I'm happy to put in the chat, is kind of, I think that the success this year of government has actually raised the bar for what to expect from government in the future. And that kind of is a good thing.
Yeah, well, I hope they take the opportunities. I've been saying this variously in different forms all year. Like they have actually, they've done their best this year. They've done their best across a range of fronts. They made decisions that I would describe as moral decisions in the pandemic, and trust has returned. Some degree of trust has returned to the system. I really hope that they are not venal and stupid enough to blow it, to basically revert to type the minute that they don't have to actually do things in the national interest and in the interests of other humans that live in Australia. I really hope they are not dickheads. But sadly, they have given me lots of reasons to worry about their capacity to be dickheads.
On that note, hey, thank you for your generosity this year and sharing this time with us. I felt it was originally kind of a form of, triage public health support. It's just ended up being good fun. I've got no idea whether we'll keep this going next year or not. I guess it'll depend a bit on your time constraints and what the world looks like, but it's been fun. And
yeah, me too.
It's been great kicking through ideas and with a really, smart person who makes me think about things a little bit differently as well. So thank you so much, Katharine. This is our second last Australia at Home. We're actually going to open up the room to Denise Schrebel and her Ozpol hashtag community, who have been fantastic on Twitter all year. Denise, because I haven't got, do you want to quickly come in if they unmute you and just tell us who we've got in the roster for Thursday, just because I don't have it in front of me, if you're there?
Yes, now I have
a bunch of independent journos who are going to join us. Hello.
Hi, now I have to remember as well. So I've already put a shameless plug in the chat. Thanks to everyone for responding to that. But on Thursday at 1 o'clock, we've got Margot Kingston, Cheryl Curnow, Simon Holmes-a-Court, Anthony Clan from the Klaxon, Dave Milner from the Shot, and Nadine Von Cohen, all in caps. So please join us. We're looking forward to a really interesting chat about the highlights of the year, the lowlights of the year, and some forecast and perhaps a glimpse of hope to 2021.
Awesome. Thanks, Denise.
Thanks today,
thanks again, Katharine. Thanks, John, for putting the report together all year. Thanks for everyone that's been turning up into this room. It's been so lovely to get to know all of you. And I've got nothing else. We can poll how we will continue to poll what the world looks like next year. We will share it with you. We'll try to make sense of complex things, but have a really safe Christmas. Hopefully it's not quite as hectic as last year. Hopefully 2021 is a little bit more stable, Katharine. No bushfires, no pandemics, no China trade boycotts, but then what would keep us busy if it wasn't for...
I'm sure we'd find something, Peter. I'm sure we would.
All right. You off for most of Jan?
Yes. I'm working on Christmas Day.
Why?
Because I'm a journalist, Charles. You remember?
Yeah.
You remember?
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, I stop next Tuesday and come back on Australia Day. So we will be in touch then. Okay. See you guys. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks a lot.